Hey guys! Well, I'm progressing along nicely with the wooden chambered surfboard build. In the previous video, I installed the fin boxes. In this video, I'm going to glass the bottom of the surfboard. If you are new to surfboard building, you might be asking, well, what is glassing? Which also can be referred to as fiberglassing, laminating. So if I use any of these terms, they mean basically the same thing. Well, not basically, they are the same thing. So glassing is the process where we cover the surfboard with fiberglass and then apply a coat of resin on it, either polyester or epoxy resin, which is what I'm going to be using. Now I know you might be asking, why am I using epoxy? Well, it's mainly for two reasons. One, it's stronger than polyester resin. And two, it doesn't give off near the amount of VOCs or fumes than polyester resin. Also, if you were building an EPS foam board, epoxy won't eat the foam, whereas polyester would. But we don't have to worry about that since this board is made out of wood. So you could technically use polyester resin to glass this wooden surfboard or any wooden surfboard. Now, the disadvantage of epoxy is it's slightly trickier to work with. The cure times are a little longer, and it's also harder to sand than compared to polyester resin. And it's also, well, way more expensive. Now, something I want to mention before I get started is there will be an overlap, or just what we call a lap, where the bottom and the top layers of the fiberglass meets, since I'll be glassing the board in two steps. So there are two different types of laps. One is called a free lap, and the second is called a cut lap. Since we're not doing any tinting or artwork, I could just use a free lap, where you just let the fiberglass adhere to this board and then overlap it with the second layer of fiberglass. However, I like using cut laps for all my boards because I believe it does a better job, but it does require a bit more work. But it's up to you what you want to do. So this board here, I did a free lap, and as you can see, you can't see where the fiberglass meets at any points. A few things before we get started. Make sure the temperature is at least in the shop 15 degrees Celsius, and the surfboard surface or body of the surfboard is that temperature as well. The epoxy won't flow very well at cold temperatures, and it will take longer to set up. Also, epoxy is low VOC, but it still gives off some fumes, so make sure to wear a respirator as well. And lastly, when we're cutting the fiberglass, be sure to wear a mask or a respirator, as little tiny strands of glass, when you cut it, get airborne, so you don't want to be breathing that into your lungs. Okay, let's get to actually glassing the board. So the steps are, vacuum off the board really well, so we're going to do that. Then lay out fiberglass on the board, cut around the fiberglass, and then apply the epoxy. And we're also going to have to do some relief cuts. So let's just get to it. I've swapped out my stands I've added these higher stands just for glassing. I'm going to cover up the arms of the old one with some plastic so no epoxy gets on them and sticks to them. But this, raise them up. Just makes it a lot more comfortable when we're glassing, when we're working. It's just make it about, I don't know, chest level or so. Whatever's comfortable for you. So now what I'm going to do is take some masking tape and mask all the way around the board. I'm just going to, like normally I would mark it if I was doing a regular surfboard, but because this is a wooden board and it's going to be clear anyway, the lap line's just going to disappear into the lamination. I'm just going to probably just maybe go like this high. I'm not going to go, like normally I go nice and deep because a foam surfboard, I want to have a little bit more strength to it because this is a wooden board. I don't really need to do that. So I'm just gonna stay kind of low down like that. So I'm gonna roll the fiberglass out onto the board, and I'm gonna cut around it so that it overlaps onto the tape for the cut lap. I'm gonna use a 6-ounce glassing schedule. I could go as low as a 4-ounce probably on the bottom and do a 4 and then a 6-ounce on the deck. But I think I'm just gonna do 6 all the way around. Oh, and I guess I should mention, what exactly does 6-ounce and 4-ounce cloth mean? Well, it just means 6 ounces per square foot is how much a piece of this cloth will weigh. So the weight designates the heavier the cloth, the stronger the cloth, basically. So 4 ounce is definitely going to be a little bit lighter. It won't be quite as strong as 6, but it will definitely be lighter in weight. Also, keep these fiberglass straps. Cut them up because we'll use them later to clean off our squeegee and stuff. Alright, now we gotta do a couple relief cuts at the nose and at the tail. So right where it meets almost at a V, well, we're gonna do a relief cut kind of like that. And like that. So that way we're going to tuck that in and that'll get tucked like that. But back here, we could almost get away with just lapping it like this, overlapping kind of like that. But it would be a little easier if we put just maybe a relief cut right at the bend here. Like that. Possibly one maybe right here. And we'll do the same on the other side, right on this corner here. So that'll get tucked like that. Like that. Alright, we're going to get ready to glass. So a couple things you need. A pair of scissors to keep on hand in case you got to cut any loose strands of fiberglass. A couple clean squeegees. I got a whole pile of them here, as you can see. A box of gloves, nitrile gloves. Get ready to change those out if you need to do something. These are super handy. Container, scale, respirator, and of course the epoxy. So the amount of resin I'm going to mix up, I'm probably going to do, I'm looking through my journal, my diary of building previous surfboards, and I'm going to do, based on a previous board, I'm going to do about 300 grams of resin and 140 grams of hardener. When mixing the resin, try not to whip air into it. Stir it nice and gently, scraping the sides, but try not to stir bubbles into it because that's just not good. It's more important for the hot or gloss coat, but you know, it's good to keep it consistent. Good best practices. let this set up a couple hours, maybe overnight, then cut out the cut lap. But it's looking really nice. Quite pleased with it. Alright, so it's been several hours now and the board has set up. It won't be fully cured for several days, but now we can flip the board and then cut off the excess, remove the tape. From now on, only touch the board with gloved hands because you don't want to transfer any oil that might be on your hands onto the surface of the board, which will then make hot coating a bit of a pain. You might get fish eyes and various little adhesion issues. Now that I got the tape removed, I'm going to sand this cut lap flush to the board. But I'm going to work real gentle and not to damage the wood, sand into the wood too much. And that'll make the next layer of fiberglass go over this edge really easily. And to do this, I'm going to use an oscillating tool. You could use a grinder, you could use a sander, you could hand sand it, whatever you want. I just like using this because it takes less elbow grease and it does a real nice job. Oh, and by the way, make sure to wear a respirator or a dust mask when you're sanding fiberglass because you don't want to breathe it in. It'll also make you itch, so I'm going to vacuum and sand at the same time to try to keep the dust down. Because this stuff, yeah, it'll really, really make you itch. So something like this is what it should look like once you're done sanding. It should blend in really nice. I'm going to try not to touch it right now with my bare hand, just so I don't want to get any oil on it. But see how that feathers really nicely in with the wood? So that's what we want. We don't want any ridge on that lap. Alright, next we're going to take some masking tape, and again, we're going to mask off the board. Where we're going to mask it is just under where we sanded the fiberglass. This will minimize the amount of fiberglass. Normally I would wrap it all the way around for a nice strong rail, but because this is a wooden board, I really don't need to. Also, use good quality masking tape. Don't cheap out. Don't get the crap stuff. Don't get the no name. Make sure to get high quality masking tape. Trust me, it'll save you headaches when you go to remove it. Actually, I forgot to put a glove on while I'm touching this. think back here for the tail, I'm gonna let it overhang to here. Just to give it a little extra reinforcement. So I forgot to talk about the type of epoxy I'm using. I'm using Resin Research. This stuff here, this stuff is specially formulated for surfboard building. It's clear, well it's blue, but it actually stays clear once you apply it. And it's a 2-to-1 ratio for the mixing of this. And if you weigh it, which is the way I highly recommend you do mix your epoxy because it's a lot more accurate, it's a 100-to-45 ratio, or you could just multiply your resin amount by 0.446 and that will give you how much hardener to add. I like using grams because it's a little more accurate. That's the resin here, nice and blue, and then this is the hardener right here. So a couple other things around working with the epoxy. Make sure to bring your room up to temperature at least 15 degrees Celsius, as I mentioned before. But really, you should have it above room temperature. If possible, like 25, 26 degrees. Your epoxy will cure a lot quicker, it'll flow better, but at the minimum 15 degrees Celsius, or else you're not going to get it to cure very well. Anything below that, the epoxy stays tacky for a really long time. Trust me, I know from experience. I had a board one time where I laminated it probably, I don't know, it was maybe 7 or 8 degrees because I didn't have this garage insulated. And it took forever for it to set up. Like after 2 days, it still hadn't set up. Now, once I brought the temperature, I heated the garage, I got it all up to temperature. It did cure, it did harden, there was no damage done. But again, the longer it takes to cure, the more likely you're going to get dust and other crap into the epoxy. So that's it for epoxy. Next, let's laminate the deck of the board. Also, one last thing. I get this question a lot. How much resin should I mix up when laminating a board? Well, it depends, because if you have a bigger nose, if it's wider, if your tail's more narrow, you're going to need either more or less resin accordingly. So I think that for one layer of 6-ounce cloth, based on what I've looked at my previous lamination history of what I've used, I've come up with a number of approximately 80 grams per linear foot of surfboard is around what I used. Now, of course, that depends. If you have a lot of fiberglass wrapping around the rail, you're going to use more fiberglass. If you're going to use less fiberglass, you're going to need less resin. So that's just a guideline. There are diagrams, charts out there on how much resin to use. It's typically in ounces, a lot of the diagrams I found. It really depends on how absorbent the foam you've used on your surfboard, because that also factors in on how much resin you use. So the short answer is it depends. So I would say maybe 80 grams per linear foot, maybe go as high as 90, even 100. If you're doing another layer at the same time as on your deck, say you're doing a deck patch too, you might want to increase it by maybe a third, maybe even 1/2. The only way, every situation's slightly different. You're going to have to kind of decide for yourself. But you could start with probably 80 grams per linear foot is a safe-ish number. But, I would err on maybe even mixing a little more. But with epoxy, the problem with it is, or not problem, but once you mix it, it kicks off. Unless you're using like a solar cured polyester resin, then you can keep it in the dark and it doesn't go bad, or it doesn't kick off or harden. Whereas in this, once you mix it, that's it. But you don't want to run short, because if you run short, then you're scrambling to mix up more. And if you're doing a tint job or a pigment job, well, then it's really hard to match that color again. So in that case, you probably want to mix more than you need, than risk running short. Anyways, that's just some thoughts on that. Oh yeah, something else. Logos. So if you want to add a logo to your board, now's the time to do it when you laminate the board, when you're laminating the first layer of glass, or a layer of glass. This stuff here is lamination paper, and you can just tape it to a piece of paper, which is what I've done. And then I just created some logos. This is the logo that I like using. This is my logo. And then I printed it off. I cut it out. And then I'm going to put this underneath the fiberglass, and then I'm just going to laminate that into the glass job. There's nothing more to it than that. Alright, so it's been several hours and the epoxy is still just slightly tack, but it's set up to the point where it's easy to cut through and it's still a little bendable. If you let it set up all the way, you can still do that, but it just takes a little more effort to cut through with a razor blade or your X-Acto knife. So I've already started this. Unfortunately, I didn't have the camera recording, but all I'm doing is just cutting along the line where the tape line, at the edge of the tape line, and then just pulling back the tape, just like as I did before. Also, make sure to wear gloved hands, at least on my cutting hand, because I'm resting up against the board. Don't want to transfer any oil to the epoxy or on the surface of the surfboard. because that won't be good for when we do the hot coat. Alright, so that is how I glass a wooden surfboard. It's slightly different than glassing a foam surfboard, where with the wooden surfboard you can get away with less overlap on the rails since the wooden board has a bit more inherent strength built into the wood than say a foam board because it's going to be a little bit more spongier. So I'm going to sum a few things up. Remember when glassing to let the room, the surfboard, the epoxy come up to at least 15 degrees Celsius, and ideally maybe even room temperature if you can. Otherwise, the epoxy may not harden properly. Also, try to do all the glassing and the hot coating all within a few days of themselves while the epoxy hasn't fully cured, so you get more of a chemical bond, or else you're going to have to sand and rough up the surfboard a bit in order to get the additional subsequent layers of epoxy to adhere. Last item is sanding is super important. The rail that I spent some time sanding, the nose, and then anywhere where the fiberglass overlapped on the board, I made sure to blend and feather the overlapping layers of fiberglass nice and even, or else what'll end up happening when you go to hot coat and then sand the hot coat, you're gonna probably have a higher chance of sanding into the weave of the fiberglass. Also, from now on, only touch the surfboard with gloved hands to prevent any possible contamination from oils that might be on your hands. This small little tip will save you headaches later when you go to hot coat. Trust me on that. And speaking of hot coating, in the next video, that's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be hot coating the surfboard. So thanks so much for watching. Hit that like button if you found this video useful, and consider subscribing for more videos. And bye for now.